Good evening. My name is Jeff Horner. This is Jeff's take on the Torah on Exodus. This evening, this is the last portion of Exodus. It is a double portion. It is Yayakhel, Pekudei, and I'm going to go through it very quickly because there's something else this evening for this weekend. This Shabbat is a very special Shabbat. It is Shabbat Parah, about the red heifer. And I'm very excited to talk about the red heifer. So I'm going to go through the final two portions of Exodus quickly so I can get to that. In a nutshell, the two last portions of Exodus are as follows. Moses assembles the people of Israel and reiterates to them the commandment to observe the Shabbat. He then conveys God's instructions regarding the making of the Mishkan, the tabernacle. The people donate the required materials in abundance, bringing gold, silver, and copper, blue, purple, and red dyed wool, goat hair, spun linen, animal skins, wood, olive oil, herbs, and precious stones. Moses has to tell them to stop giving. A team of wise-hearted artisans make the Mishkan and its furnishings, as detailed in the previous Torah readings of Teruma, Tzediva, and Ketisa. 3 layers of roof coverings, 48 gold-plated wall panels, and 100 silver foundation sockets. The veil that separates the sanctuary's 2 chambers and the screen that fronts it. The ark and its cover with the cherubim, the table and its showbread, the 7-branched menorah with its specially prepared oil, the golden altar and the incense burned on it, the anointing oil, the outdoor altar for burnt offerings and all its implements, the hangings, the posts, the foundation sockets for the courtyard, and the basin and its pedestal, made out of copper mirrors. An accounting is made of the gold, silver, and copper donated by the people for the making of the Mishkan. Betzalel, Alahav, and their assistants make the 8 priestly garments, the ephod, breastplate, cloak, crown, turban, tunic, sash, and breeches, according to the specifications communicated to Moses. The Mishkan is completed, and all its components are brought to Moses, who erects it and anoints it with the holy anointing oil, and initiates Aaron and his 4 sons into the priesthood. A cloud appears over the Mishkan, signifying the divine presence that has come to dwell within it. And with that, Exodus ends. And with the ending of a book of the Torah, we stand up and we go, Chazak, Chazak, V'nik Hezik. But this is a special evening. This is a special reading because we are now finished with Purim and about to begin Passover. And Passover is the actual story of Exodus. So we are reviewing in Passover what we just discussed in Exodus. But now, for this special Shabbat, Shabbat Parah, we are given one of the most esoteric chapters in the Torah. It is Numbers 19:1 through 19:22. I'm going to read it to you. The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, "This is the ritual law that the Lord had commanded. Instruct the Israelite people to bring you a red cow without blemish, in which there is no defect and on which no yoke has been laid. You shall give it to Eleazar the priest. It shall be taken outside the camp and slaughtered in his presence. Eleazar the priest shall take some of its blood with his fingers and sprinkle it 7 times toward the front of the tent of meeting. The cow shall be burned in his sight, its hide, flesh, and blood shall be burned, its dung included. And the priest shall take cedar wood, hyssop, and crimson stuff, and throw them into the fire, consuming the cow. The priest shall wash his garments and bathe his body in water. After that, the priest may re-enter the camp, but he shall be unclean until evening. He who performed the burning shall also wash his garments in water, bathe his body in water, and be unclean until evening. A man who is clean shall gather up the ashes of the cow and deposit them outside of the camp in a clean place, to be kept for water of lustration for the Israelite community. It is for cleansing. He who gathers up the ashes of the cow shall also wash his clothes and be unclean until evening. This shall be a permanent law for the Israelites and for the strangers who reside among you. He who touches the corpse of any human being shall be unclean for 7 days. He shall cleanse himself with it on the 3rd day and on the 7th day, and then be clean. If he fails to cleanse himself on the 3rd and 7th day, he shall not be clean. Whosoever touches a corpse, the body of a person who has died, and does not cleanse himself, defiles the Lord's tabernacle. That person shall be cut off from Israel. Since the water of lustration was not dashed on him, he remains unclean. His uncleanliness is still upon him. This is the ritual. When a person dies in a tent, whoever enters the tent and whoever is in the tent shall be unclean 7 days. And every open vessel with no lid fastened down shall be unclean. And in the open, anyone who touches a person who is killed or has died naturally, or human bone, or a grave, shall be unclean 7 days. Some of the ashes from the fire of cleansing shall be taken for the unclean person, and fresh water shall be added to them in a vessel. A person who is clean shall take hyssop, dip it in the water, and sprinkle on the tent and on all the vessels and the people who were there, or him who touched the bones, or the person who was killed or died naturally on the grave. The clean person shall sprinkle it upon the unclean person on the 3rd day and on the 7th day, thus cleansing him by the 7th day. He shall then wash his clothes and bathe in water, and at nightfall he shall be clean. If anyone who has become unclean fails to cleanse himself, that person shall be cut off from the congregation, for he has defiled the Lord's sanctuary. The water of lustration was not dashed on him. He is unclean. That shall be for them a law for all time. Further, he who sprinkled the water of lustration shall wash his clothes, and whoever touches the water of lustration shall be unclean until evening. Whatever that unclean person touches shall be unclean, and the person who touches him shall be unclean until evening. That is the Torah reading. Now, I'm going to talk also about the Haftorah. I have not discussed any Haftorahs up until this point, but this Haftorah goes right along with this Torah reading. And again, this is one of the most esoteric and enigmatic chapters in the entire Torah. The Haftorah is from Ezekiel 36:16 to 38. The word of the Lord came to me, O mortal, when the house of Israel dwelt on their own soil, they defiled it with their ways and their deeds. Their ways were in my sight like the uncleanliness of a menstruing woman. So I poured out my wrath on them for the blood which they shed upon their land, and for the fetishes in which they defiled it. I scattered them among the nations, and they were dispersed throughout the countries. I punished them in accordance with their ways and their deeds. But when they came to those nations, they caused my holy name to be profaned, in that it was said of them, These are the people of the Lord, yet they had to leave his land. Therefore I am concerned for my holy name, which the house of Israel have caused to be profaned among the nations to which they have come. Say to the house of Israel, Thus said the Lord God, Not for your sake will I act, O house of Israel, but for my holy name, which you have caused to be profaned among the nations to which you have come. I will sanctify my great name which has been profaned among the nations. among whom you have caused it to be profaned. And the nations shall know that I am the Lord, declares the Lord God, when I manifest my holiness before their eyes through you. I will take you from among the nations and gather you from among all the countries, and I will bring you back to your own land. I will sprinkle clean water upon you, and you shall be clean. I will cleanse you from all your uncleanliness and from all your fetishes, and I will give you a new heart and put new spirit in you. I will remove the heart of stone from your body and give you a heart of flesh. And I will put my spirit into you. Thus I will cause you to follow my laws faithfully, to observe my rules. Then you shall dwell in the land which I gave to your fathers, and you shall be my people, and I will be your God. And when I have delivered you from your uncleanliness, I will summon the grain and make it abundant, and I will not bring famine upon you. I will make the fruit of your trees and the crops of your fields abundant, so that you shall never again be humiliated before the nations because of famine. Then you shall recall your evil ways and your base conduct, and you shall loathe yourselves from your iniquities and your abhorrent practices. Not for your sake will I act, declares the Lord God. Take good note. Be ashamed and humiliated because of your ways, O house of Israel. Thus said the Lord God, when I have cleansed you of all your iniquities, I will people your settlements, and the ruined places shall be rebuilt. And the desolate land, after lying waste in the sight of every passerby, shall again be tilled. And men shall say, that land, once desolate, has become like the Garden of Eden, and the cities, once ruined, desolate, and ravaged, are now populated and fortified. And the nations that are left around you shall know that I, the Lord, have rebuilt the ravaged places and replanted the desolate land. I, the Lord, have spoken and will act. Thus said the Lord God. Moreover, in this I will respond to the house of Israel and act for their sake. I will multiply their people like sheep. As Jerusalem is filled with sacrificial sheep during her festivals, so shall the ruined cities be filled with flocks of people, and they shall know that I am the Lord. Well, that's pretty heavy stuff. In the Torah reading, we talk about the famous or infamous red heifer, the red cow that has no defect in which no yoke has been laid. Let's meet the red heifer. This is from Chabad.org. One of the most enigmatic mitzvahs in the Torah is the para aduma, the red heifer, which was used for ritual purification. There have been only 9 such heifers in history, and our tradition tells us that there will be one more in the future. Here's an overview of the mysterious red heifer, which left even King Solomon, the wisest of all men, scratching his head in wonderment. What was it needed for? Before we can discuss the actual red heifer, we need a bit of background information on the biblical laws of ritual purity. There is a common misconception that the biblical notion of impurity implies filth or susceptibility to infection. Maimonides writes, however, that it's a gesiret ha-katuv, a super-rational mandate of the Torah. It has no rationale that we can comprehend. One form of impurity is contracted by touching, or being under the same roof as a corpse. Once defiled, one could not enter the holy temple, or partake of the sacrificial offerings or other sacred foods. In order to be purified, one had to be sprinkled with a special mixture of spring water and ashes from the burned remains of the red heifer. The laws of the red heifer are presented at the very beginning of the Torah portion of Shukat. This is the statute of the Torah which the Lord commanded, saying, Speak to the children of Israel and have them take for you a perfectly red, unblemished cow, upon which no yoke was laid. The sages inferred that the red heifer must be completely red. Even 2 black hairs would render it invalid, and it must not have done any work in its lifetime. Even having a yoke placed on its back or having mated would disqualify it. Once a candidate was found, and there was need for more purifying ash water, the cow would be slaughtered and burned on a pyre, along with a cedar branch, hyssop spring, and crimson wool. The ceremony took place on the Mount of Olives, opposite the Temple Mount. The ashes would then be mixed with carefully guarded water drawn from a spring. Those who came in contact with the dead would be sprinkled with the ash water on the 3rd and 7th days after their defilement. On the 7th day, they would immerse in a mikveh, and that night they would revert to their original pure status. Since there is no longer a temple in Jerusalem, the rituals of the red heifer, as well as most of the laws surrounding ritual purity, will be applicable only in the Messianic era. When introducing this mitzvah, the Torah states, "This is the statute of the Torah." The word statute, chak, denotes a law that defies reason. Since the Torah prefaces the mitzvah by calling it the chak of the Torah, it appears that this mitzvah must somehow be more mysterious and more super-rational than any other law. Rashi elaborates. Because Satan and the nations of the world taught Israel, what is this commandment and what purpose does it have? Therefore, the Torah uses the term statute. I have decreed it. You have no right to challenge it. In reference to the red heifer, King Solomon famously stated, I have said I would become wise, but it is far from me. The Midrash expounds, when all other laws of Torah I held my footing, but when it comes to teaching of the heifer, I analyzed, I asked, and I researched without understanding. There are other laws in the Torah that do not have a comprehensible rationale. What is so strange about this particular law? The red heifer presents a great paradox. The priest who is involved in the preparation of the heifer himself becomes impure through the process. So he's purifying something and becomes impure by doing a purification. Strange indeed. That leads us to a greater puzzle. Why would God give us a law that no one can understand? Would it spoil some vast eternal plan if he would give us a mitzvah that resonates with our mortal minds so that we could fulfill it with deep appreciation? Hasidic philosophy answers thusly. We do the mitzvahs not because we understand them, but because they are his will. And this also extends to the mitzvahs we think we understand. We need to do these mitzvahs simply because they are God's will, not because they make sense to us. Conversely, the Midrash also tells us that God did reveal the secret of the red heifer to Moses. Why? Because we are intelligent beings who crave understanding. The very knowledge that someone out there understood these laws makes them more palatable to us and allows us to appreciate them as much as the mitzvahs we understand. The quest for the red heifer. It appears that finding an appropriate heifer was quite challenging. For example, the Talmud tells the story of a Gentile named Dema who dealt in precious gems. At one point, the sages of Israel approached him to purchase a replacement gem for the breastplate of the high priest. Since in order to retrieve the stone, Dema would need to wake his sleeping father, he refused to show them the stone. Even when the sages raised the price, he did not budge. Eventually, the father woke up, and Dema made the sale. As a reward for the exemplary lengths he went to honor his father, Dema merited to have a red heifer born in his herd, which again fetched him a very large sum from the temple treasury. Even today, one hears about the birth of a perfectly red cow, and speculation is raised as to whether it is the harbinger of the Messianic era. Now that we've sparked your interest, you'll want to learn more about this mysterious mitzvah. Let's talk about it. I have a lot of things that I downloaded on this from the internet. Before I get into this, what makes this so fascinating? This is one of the only passages in the Torah that discusses what to do about death. People die. In biblical times, people died all the time. People died in childbirth. People died from war. People died young. People died old. And the causes of death were not understood. There was no such thing as cancer. There was no such thing as heart disease. There was no such thing as a lot of the diseases we know of today. There was no science. So therefore, someone was sitting in a tent and they died. Another part of this is the fact that death was permanent. If someone left you and they were going on a journey, they were going to whether they're going to hunt or whether they're going to a distant land or whatever, there's always the chance that they would come back. No one comes back from death. This person that you had this relationship with is suddenly gone. And although you can still have the relationship in your heart, you can never really have that relationship with that person again. People had to come to grips with that. People had to have a ritual that would allow them to then feel good about coming to grips with the death of loved ones. This is called the calf's mother. This is from the Lubavitch. The chapter in the Torah of the law of the red heifer is commanded by God to Moses as an antidote to the state of ritual impurity engendered by contact with death. It's not just that the law of the red heifer cannot be logically explained. Indeed, there exists an entire category of mitzvot called chakim, decrees, whose defining criteria is that they transcend human understanding. What's unique about the red heifer is that while other chakim at least follow an internal logic of their own, the laws of the red heifer are fraught with paradox and inconsistency. Thus, the laws of the red heifer are introduced by the Torah with the word, "This is the chak of the Torah," as if to say, this is the Torah's ultimate chak, the mitzvah that most vividly demonstrates the super rationality of its divine commandments. What does this mean? We understand when we are taught something, we all learn it in our own way and at our own pace. When we're taught to read, when we're taught to write, when we're taught anything that takes time to be rationally taught, we each learn at our own pace and we each learn at our own speed. So if you're teaching someone Hebrew, someone may get it very quickly, someone may get it very slowly, but they are all being taught Hebrew and they're all doing the mitzvot of learning Hebrew. What this is about is a mitzvot of doing something because you don't know why. If you are told, stand up, hop on one foot, wave your right hand, turn around twice, and drink a glass of water. And you're told it's a mitzvot, you have to do this. You would do it. And everyone would do it the same way. Because you were told to stand up, hop on one foot, turn around, raise your right hand, and drink a glass of water. So everyone would do that mitzvot the same way. So everyone knows how to do it, but doesn't know why. We have that today. We're working on a computer. You are watching me through your computer. Do you really know how the computer works? Do you really know where the cloud is? It's all wires and electronics and stuff like that. So you believe you know the mitzvot of working with this computer and learning Torah, different things, but you don't know how it actually works. Herein lies how the red heifer is brought to all the people. The mystery of death. The Lubavitcher Rebbe explains that the most incomprehensible of human experiences, the phenomenon of death, can be sublimated only with the most incomparable of divine mitzvot, the ashes and water of the red heifer. Physically and biologically, death makes perfect sense. Yet we all, even a man such as Moses, find death utterly incomprehensible, utterly devastating to our sense of reality. Despite all the evidence to the contrary, something deep inside us insists that life is the natural, axiomatic state of the human being, and that its cessation is a violation of the most basic laws of existence. For such in truth is the fundamental nature of man. True, the human body is physical flesh and as such shares the desolate nature of all things physical, but it is animated by a soul that is the spark of the divine, and fortified with the eternity and indestructibility of its source. In essence, human life is eternal. Indeed, the first man was created to live forever, but then he violated the divine will, thereby distancing himself from his source and introducing the phenomenon of death into the human experience. Our sages tell us that when the children of Israel stood at Sinai to receive the Torah from God, they were restored to the original perfection in which man was first created. The Torah reinstated the original undiluted bond between God and man, so that man was once more granted freedom from the angel of death. But this time, too, the state of perfect connection to God was short-lived. 40 days after the people of Israel stood at Sinai, they transgressed the divine decree, "You shall have no other gods before me," by worshipping the calf of gold. The pestilence of death, introduced into the world by Adam's sin and banished at Sinai, was reintroduced by the sins of the golden calf. This explains the connection between the red heifer and the golden calf expressed in the Midrash parable. A maid's child once dirtied the royal palace. Said the king, "Let his mother come and clean up her child's filth." By the same token, God says that the heifer atone for the deed of the calf. In our post-calf world, the imperfection in our relationship with God finds its most noxious expression in the phenomenon of death. Contact with death thus spawns the most severe form of spiritual impurity, which can be mitigated only by the mother of the golden calf, the most super-rational of the divine decrees, the red heifer. This was God's reply to Moses' cry, "Master of the universe, this is a purification." "Moses," God said, "it is a chak, a decree that I have decreed. Certain things are so overwhelming to my creations that they can only be overcome by submitting to an absolute command from an absolute authority. I have therefore commanded laws to instruct you what to do when your lives are touched by death. These are super-rational, even irrational laws, for only such laws can facilitate your recovery. It is only by force of an utterly incomprehensible divine decree that you can recover from such utter devastation to a living being's self-definition. Ultimately, however, there will come a day when the original bond between man and God will once more be restored. This time, our prophets promise, it will be immune to disruption by sin, since God will slaughter the inclination of evil in the heart of man and remove the spirit of impurity from the earth, with the result that death shall cease forever. We will never understand death because we always want to cling to life, and life and death are separated. One who has died can never be born again, despite what some other religions think. One who has died, well, let's understand what was going on in biblical times. There was no refrigeration, as we know, so our body would start to decompose very quickly, and our body would start to give off, maybe the body had disease, maybe the person died of, could be anything, he could have died from influenza or pox or communicable diseases. So A, you had to bury him in the ground within 24 hours. And B, if you touched this corpse, you had to be cleansed. And not only be cleansed, clean yourself with water, and then be cleansed with this ritual purification. So that it was understood that touching death was not a good thing. It was understood that there were bad things going on in a dead body. But again, being biblical times, they did the best they could with what they had. This is also from Chabad. It talks about a strange commandment. I say strange because there are certain details of the commandment to remove defilement by sprinkling the ashes of the red heifer that are unlike any other commandment in the Torah. The commandment of the red heifer is totally irrational. There is no rhyme or reason by which a person can figure out how this procedure makes any sense. Nevertheless, the Torah describes an exact procedure that a person must undergo if he wishes to rid himself of the impurity which is brought about by contact with a dead body. Doesn't that sound like superstition? Doesn't that sound like knock on wood or other things that you do to ward off evil? When a person sneezes, you say, bless you, or gesundheit. Right? This comes from when people thought that when you sneezed, there was a point that the devil could enter your body. So they quickly said, bless you, so that the devil wouldn't get in. This entire portion of the red heifer sounds like something like that. Let's say a person who lived in biblical times was sitting in his tent when suddenly someone in that tent passed away. Who knows why? That's the point. That person, because he was in the same tent at the moment of the other person's death, has contracted the strongest possible type of impurity, the impurity of actual death. Somebody who's at a funeral, or is to carry the dead body from the house in which a person died to the cemetery, or bury the person, this is one of the greatest commandments, to bring a Jewish body to a Jewish burial, becomes extremely impure. Why do I say extremely? Because there are levels in impurity. Contact with the dead is the most intense kind. In order for this person to return to a state of purity, he has to undergo a 7-day process of spiritual purification, during which time he cannot visit the holy temple, bring a sacrifice, touch ritually pure food, and so on. This, of course, applied in biblical and temple times, not today. Today, only members of the priestly family observe some of the commandments of purity and impurity. The process of purification includes being sprinkled with ashes from a red heifer that was burned in a very special way. These ashes were mixed with spring water and other ingredients. This process sounds strange. To our minds, it doesn't make sense. And yet, the Torah says, whether you like it or not, this is the decree of the Torah. You don't like it, you can remain impure. Generally, it's no sin to remain impure for an extended period of time. If a person wants to be ritually impure for the rest of his life, go ahead. But as long as you are impure, you cannot do the following things. You cannot come to the temple. You cannot bring a sacrifice. You cannot touch ritually pure food. If you want to be out of it, that's your privilege. But if you want to come back, you must go through the entire process. Just like going through a mikvah. This is a ritual purification. Now, the interesting thing about it is that those priests who were involved in preparing the ashes of the red heifer, in order to help their fellow Jews become pure again, became impure. The Torah says that the mystery, the paradox of the red heifer, is that it purified the impure and made impure the pure. How does something that has the ability to purify one person cause impurity in another? It doesn't appear to make sense. It's a contradiction. Yet, this is the decree of the Torah. The commandments of the Torah are divided into three categories. They're called Mishpatim, Chukim, and Edot. The category of commandments called Mishpatim, which is probably the majority of the Torah, refers to those commandments that are rational. They are so rational that even if the Torah didn't tell us, we'd probably figure them out by ourselves. Like the prohibition against murder. You don't have to be a very pious, God-fearing Jew to realize that killing is not a nice thing to do. Many people are not murderers, even though they're not righteous or ethical. This is the category of Mishpatim. Edot are a different kind of commandment. Edot are those commandments that we probably would never have invented on our own accord, but because the Torah told us, we can see some logic in them. Basically, these are the commandments that have to do with testimony. They testify that certain historical facts occurred, even such as Passover, when God took us out of Egypt. Our forefathers ate matzah, unleavened bread, so that we also eat matzah. It could be that we'd never come up with it on our own, but we can accept it. It makes sense in a certain way. Chukim are those commandments that we just cannot figure out rationally. The classic example is the red heifer. Who would ever think of such a commandment? Take a red heifer, burn it, sprinkle its ashes. Who would invent such a commandment? No one. Another example is the prohibition against wearing linen and wool. Who would ever think of such a commandment, that you shouldn't be able to wear linen or wool? Why not? Or to deny yourself cheeseburgers. Why should the Torah say that this food is no good, this food is good, this meat is kosher because it comes from an animal that chews its cud and has split hooves, whereas the other meat is not kosher because it comes from an animal that does not have these qualifications? We see that there are certain commandments that just don't make mortal sense. Try as you will never find a rational reason for these commandments. These commandments are called chukim. Laws, statutes, decrees. You like it, you don't like it, that's the Jewish way. Take it or leave it. The red heifer falls into the category of chukim. It is the classical decree. The Torah says, this is the decree of the Torah, not this is the decree of the red heifer, as if to say, this is the paradigm decree of the entire Torah. If you want to know what the whole Torah is about, look at the red heifer. And then we say to ourselves, but how can you say that this is the decree of the Torah? This is so different from the other commandments. It's not like the other commandments. It's unusual. It's the exception, not the rule. I don't know any other commandment that's so weird. We may have to look a little bit deeper in order to see that hidden in the commandment of the red heifer are many of the most fundamental concepts of the Torah. In every person, there are two levels. There's the level of intellect, and there's the level of will. Will and intellect are not the same thing. You might think that since a person is basically an intelligent being, the will and the intellect are the same thing. You want what makes sense, and what makes sense is what you want. But it doesn't always work that way. You could know logically that this is the right thing, but you don't want it. You want something else, which everybody tells you is crazy. For example, take fattening foods. Pizza, for example. The doctor and your mom will tell you, you should not eat that. It has so many calories and so much fat. But you say, I don't care. I like the taste. Or it could be with a piece of clothing. It's only dry cleanable, it's white, it's too expensive, it doesn't make sense. But the kid says, I want it, I like it. Will is will and brains are brains. They are not the same thing. Intellect is something that you can explain in words. Will is something that is higher than intellect that you cannot explain. If somebody asks you, why do you want this thing? It doesn't make sense, it's crazy. You can't even explain to them why. I just want it. That's it. I want it. I can't tell you why, I just want it. Ask any 3-year-old. I want, mine, I want. Will, not intellect. The same way that our will transcends intellect, so too with an obvious difference with God, because we are created in God's image. Everything that exists in a person is a mirror of what's going on in God himself. Hasidic teaching explains that there's a level of God revelation which can be understood rationally, and there's a level of God that transcends intellect that we can never understand. Those commandments which are called mishpatim, those that make sense to us, are actually at a lower level. For every commandment God asks of us, don't murder, don't steal, there is a divine reason, a divine desire that God has for us to do that commandment. Some of the commandments were contracted. They came down in such a way that they can be understood even by limited human intellect. Imagine a mother trying to tell her 3-year-old child why he has to eat vegetables. See, here's my point. She says, if you eat the vegetables, you will grow, you'll be strong, your teeth won't hurt, you'll see well at night. She can't really explain to the child everything it says in the textbook about vitamins, but she tries to condense the idea that vegetables are healthy to her child in whatever language. She's bringing it down to the child's level. There are certain things that parents don't even try to explain. It's just too complicated. They will never be able to give this concept to a 3-year-old. So when the 3-year-old says, Mom, why do I have to? You say, listen, honey, I'm your mommy. You're my child, and you're going to do this because I said so, because mommy knows best. You know that when the child is 25 and is herself a mother, you will then try to talk it out. But right now, I'm your mommy. You must listen to me. Certain things God cannot explain to us. Our intellect compared to God is far lower than that of a 3-year-old compared to a 25-year-old. The child is going to be a parent someday. Right now the child is 3, but when he's 6, when he's 10, his intellect grows. And eventually he and you will be on the same level. Sometimes children surpass their parents in intelligence. It's just a relative thing. But the intelligence of a human being compared to the Creator, that gap is infinite. These commandments that we call chukim are on such a level that there is no way God could condense the reason or the rationality behind them in terms the human mind can grasp. And that's why God doesn't even try. We just do it because he said so. It's not possible for a human being to understand a chok, a decree. Therefore, a chok, in a sense, is higher than a mishpat, a commandment that we understand, because it cannot come down to the level of understanding. Just take it and do it. It's a Jewish thing to do. That's what you tell a person when a person asks, why? You ask, are you Jewish? If you're Jewish, then you should know that this is what Jewish people do. This is part of the Jewish Torah. You can't understand it, but it's the Jewish thing to do, so do it. You don't understand it, you don't have to understand everything. Who says you have to understand everything? But when you do a commandment that doesn't make sense to you, then your mind can't even relate to it all, and you do it anyway, you're reaching a part of God which is called Eitzim, the essence. In other words, God's intellect is a lower dimension of God than God's essence, just as our intellect is lower than our will. Would you say that essence of a person is his IQ? No, because a person's intellectual level is one of the manifestations of who he is, but it's not him. You are something that is greater than any of your powers. Your brain is a detail of you, but you are greater than your brain, your speech, and your powers. The word etzim in Hebrew means bone. Just as we know that inside each of our limbs there's a bone, but it also means the essence, what's inside. It is the quality of what is it. That's the essence. The essence of God is his innermost core. It's far higher than any explanation. When you do a commandment that you don't understand, you're hooking in not to God's brain, but to God's essence. And that's much higher. When you say, I am doing the commandment because I enjoy doing it, because it makes me feel good, because it makes so much sense, because I like it, that's one level. But a much higher level is reached when one can say, I am doing it because I am a Jew. I have a Jewish soul, and my God said that he wants me to do this, so I'm going to do it. I don't know if I understand it. I don't know if I agree with it, but I'm going to do it anyway. When you do a commandment like that, it's infinitely greater than doing the commandment because you understand it. You are transcending the level of intellect. The essence of your soul is joining with the essence of God. This means that your highest level is linking up with God's highest level. It's a superior way of serving God. To put it another way, we are all different in many ways. If we all take an IQ test right now, we would not get all the same mark. Let's say all of us were meeting together in a room and would have to perform a rational commandment, the commandment of learning Torah, for example. We talked about this earlier. Suppose somebody would come and say, I want everybody for the next hour to learn Torah. It's a commandment to learn Torah. Everybody in the room would do it differently. Those who could learn it with commentaries would learn it at a very high level. Those who could barely read Hebrew would do it on a lower level. Everybody would learn Torah according to the level of insight. It would be very, very different. Some would enjoy it, some wouldn't enjoy it. Everybody would be different. However, if God came and said to you, I want you to do something new. I want you to raise your right hand like this and your left hand like that, jump 4 times, turn around and look at the ceiling. No one would understand what this is about, but we'd all do it. In other words, a thing that has to do with intellect varies. Everybody does it according to their own intellect. But a thing that has nothing to do with intellect is all the same. It is indicative of what we all have in common. As far as essence is concerned, we are all the same. The essence of the soul is the same for all Jews. It has nothing to do with things that happen after you came down to earth. So again, when a Jew observes the commandment which is called a chak, a decree, it is a very lofty way of serving God. Finally, the Torah reading of Parshat Parah, Numbers 19, 1 through 22, provides an important example, although we are not actually able to carry out this law today. This is a purification procedure using the red heifer. A person who has been in contact with the dead becomes impure in a special way, meaning that he or she may not enter the temple. The ashes of the red heifer are put in water, and a few drops of the water are sprinkled on the impure person. Now he or she is pure and is again able to enter the temple. The Torah uses the word statute, shukat, to describe this commandment. We do not understand the concept of impurity, nor why the red heifer procedure renders the person pure. The law of the red heifer is a symbol for all the laws we cannot reduce to simple, rational terms. An example in daily life today is keeping kosher. Although we did not understand the kosher laws, we can still accept them and keep them. They are organs of the body of the Torah which have a vital use, even though the exact way they function is not clear to us now. Our service to God cannot be limited by our understanding. In daily life, a person eats food long before understanding how the digestive process works. We use a computer even though we may have no idea how it works. We go to the doctor and follow his or her advice to take medicine, including herbal medicine, without understanding why it should have a curative effect. When we perform a commandment without knowing its full meaning, we demonstrate that we are doing this because we know it has been commanded by God in the Torah, and that we believe and trust that this is good for us as individuals and ultimately for the whole world. This bonds us to God, and this is the true purpose of all the commandments. At the same time, God tells us to use our intellect as much as possible in order to be able to understand more. This also applies to the laws we think we do understand. In every Jewish teaching, there are many levels, just as there are endless details to discover about each organ of the body and how it connects to the whole. Each mitzvah connects us to God and gives us the opportunity to explore more and more of its meanings. The red heifer is important because it makes us do something so far out of our comfort zone and so far from our understanding, and yet we do it because we're told to do it. We are, as children, listening to our parent. Do this because I say so. And so we do. And within that, we get the feelings of accomplishment and the feelings of having done something good for the sake of doing something good, because we don't quite understand what we've done, but we know that it was the right thing to do. I am Jeff Horner. I have really enjoyed doing the book of Exodus. I thank you so much for listening, and Shabbat Shalom.